For decades, the Soviet space program was shrouded in secrecy. It was a history of public successes and hidden disasters, which claimed more than 160 lives. It wasn't until the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the secret history of Soviet space disasters was finally revealed. The Soviet mission to dominate space would ultimately become nothing more than a dusty dream. But during the 1960s, two space programs are in full gear with the moon as their goal. Each superpower desperately wants to be the first to put a man on the moon. To put their cosmonauts on the moon, Russia needs a rocket big enough to get them there.
The N-1 was a super rocket, counterpart to American Saturn, to launch Soviet counterpart to Apollo to the moon.
By the late 1960s, the Saturn V has proven itself as NASA's workhorse. By early 1969, the Soviets are preparing to launch the N-1. Unlike the Saturn, it is top secret. While the Saturn V uses 11 huge engines in 3 stages, the Soviet N-1 relies on a complicated array of 42 smaller engines. There are 30 engines in the first stage alone, 8 more in stage 2, while the third stage has the 4 final engines. But with more engines, the risks multiply.
There's 3 huge stages and 30 engines in the first stage, all built by a manufacturer that was not particularly experienced in building rockets. It was an aircraft engine builder. It was horribly complicated.
The gigantic takeoff pad is readied as the launch date for the Mammoth rocket draws near. On February 21st, 1969, the Soviets launch the unmanned N-1. Liftoff goes smoothly. Then, 70 seconds into flight, the engines malfunction. The rocket is completely destroyed, and so, it seems, are Soviet hopes of beating America to the moon. But the Soviets still believe the N-1 can succeed. On July 3, 1969, 2 weeks before the Apollo 11 launch, the Russians send up a second N-1.
By the time it cleared the tower, this launch vehicle had shut down all of its engines except one, which ultimately caused the vehicle to tip over and come down, crashing like that onto the launch facility, totally destroying the launch facility and knocking the turning tower gantry off its turning base and also leveling one of the lightning towers completely. It was like a tactical nuke blast.
The damage is devastating. It is 2 years before the Soviets will be able to use the rocket facility again. But America is right on schedule. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 takes off for its historic journey to the moon. For 4 days, the world waits to know its fate. What no one but American intelligence and NASA know is that the Soviets haven't given up. 3 days earlier, they've launched Luna 15, a secret unmanned moon probe in a standard rocket.
They were going to go to the moon, pick up a bit of dirt, take it back, and say, look at how clever we Soviets are. We've gone there, we brought back some soil without risking human life at a fraction of the cost, and look at how much money the Americans wasted in this silly political competition with us.
If the 2 rockets perform according to plan, they will be in the moon's orbit at the same time. NASA keeps the news from the public. But Apollo 11 astronauts Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin are informed.
My father never expressed any concern on my part, and I think he is a good enough engineer to understand the probabilities of there actually being some sort of a collision. I mean, space is a very big place, and the prospect of 2 spacecraft colliding is pretty unlikely.
The next day, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong become the first people in history to set foot on the moon. Armstrong is the first off the spacecraft.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Apollo 11 mission is a shining achievement for the American space program. The Luna 15 meets a darker and little-known fate as it crashes into the lunar surface. The high drama of the moon race has its origins in the V-2 missile programs of Nazi Germany. By the end of World War II, America and Russia are moving into position for the Cold War. Both countries want Germany's rocket research.
The fact that Nazi Germany spent all that money and used all those people, including the slave laborers, to build rockets to bombard London, saved the American and Russian missile and space programs a decade or more.
America acts quickly. Within months of the war's end, 100 of the top German rocket men are in the United States. The press is told they are truck drivers, but the Germans know what they will be working on: rockets. Among them is Wernher von Braun, the director of the Nazi V-2 program and the man who will help lead America to the moon. As important as the Germans were, it was the rockets themselves, the V-2s, which would be the foundation for both the American and Soviet missile programs. The Soviet missile program is led by an unlikely figure, Sergei Korolyov, a rocket scientist who'd spent years in a Gulag prison, a victim of Stalin's purges.
In those days, it was necessary for just one of your colleagues to say you were disloyal. And a colleague, we think, made the claim that he wasn't working seriously on the rockets that were for the military defense program, but had these fantasies about space. In any case, Korolyov gets arrested, sent to the Gulag, almost dies, works in the gold mines, was there for, it's not clear how long, maybe as long as a year.
Korolyov is rescued because of his mathematical education, aeronautical knowledge, and personal connections, but mostly because the Soviet military needs him to design planes. Out of prison, one of Korolyov's jobs in the 1950s is to counter the threat of America's Strategic Air Command. America's huge bomber fleet is armed with nuclear warheads and on call 24 hours a day. To the Soviets, it's like a dagger pointed at their throat. By 1957, Korolyov is ready to test his own creation, the R-7 Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or ICBM. Korolyov's R-7 has 4 strap-on boosters that can power it into interplanetary altitudes and then explode it into American soil. The R-7 is revolutionary, the first missile that can deliver a nuclear warhead from one continent to another. But Korolyov's new engine design is not yet dependable. Meanwhile, a world away in New Mexico, America is having its own struggles with its modified V-2. Finally, on August 21st, 1957, Korolyov's R-7 became the world's first ICBM to fly successfully, disintegrating harmlessly as planned thousands of miles from its launching point. Suddenly, President Eisenhower is in political trouble. He's put America's resources into its huge arsenal of B-52s instead of missiles. Congress quickly declares that America is in danger, on the wrong side of a missile gap. October 4th, 1957, another shock for America. The Soviets send Sputnik 1 into space on top of another Korolyov R-7 rocket. It is the first successful orbit of a man-made satellite, and the United States is left reeling by the unexpected display of Russian rocket know-how. President Eisenhower tries to quell American panic.
Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations. I consider our country's satellite program to be well designed and properly scheduled to achieve the scientific purposes for which it was initiated.
Just 4 weeks after Sputnik 1's success, the Soviets launch Sputnik 2, this time with a passenger. a dog named Laika, meaning barker. Laika survives for several days in space. Sputnik 2 is another impressive success for the Soviet Union.
This is a country that had been marched on, stomped on, and had a long, decades of feudalism. And suddenly, in the 50s and 60s, they're being told, you are the best, and Exhibit A is our space program, which is the best in the world. This was the first time that the Russian people had ever believed that they were a superpower.
Under pressure from the Russians, the United States rushes to get an American satellite into the sky. On December 6, 1957, a Navy-designed Vanguard rocket is ready, or so the U.S. thinks. The grapefruit-sized satellite it carries is America's answer to Sputnik. It's a humiliating failure for the United States. At the UN, Soviet delegates ask if the United States might wish to receive foreign aid under Moscow's program of technical assistance to backward nations. But there's much Khrushchev is keeping secret.
We never saw video footage or TV footage of the Soviet rockets blowing up because it was done in secrecy. And even the R-7 only flew successfully on its fourth attempt, whereas the US program was in the full limelight of the media.
On January 31st, 1958, America finally gets its first satellite into orbit. It's the Army's Explorer 1, and it uses a rocket built under the direction of Wernher von Braun. Eisenhower makes a decision that will change America's space program forever. He unifies all research into one department. In October of 1958, a new National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, takes over the job. NASA's first step is to choose 7 pilots who will be America's first men in space. To the country, they are more than astronauts. They are a nation's hope to restore its technological self-esteem.
We went for military test pilots who were all in their 30s. In fact, John Glenn was 40, who had degrees or a lot of experience in engineering, whereas the Russians got a bunch of younger men who were not remotely well educated by the Mercury standards. They didn't need to be very experienced, they just sort of needed to be healthy and trainable.
Sergei Korolev, seen here next to his wife, would lead this group into the frontier of space. 6 would become Russia's first cosmonauts. 1 would become Russia's first casualty. These cosmonauts would be the Soviets' answer to NASA's Mercury 7. But no amount of training can eliminate human error. In March 1961, Valentin Bondarenko becomes the first casualty of the Soviet program.
Valentin Bondarenko was the youngest member of the first group of 20 Soviet cosmonauts, and he made a very forgivable human error. He literally removed an electrode and used an alcohol-soaked cotton swab to clean the place where the electrode or probe had been on his skin, and just flicked it toward a table. Unfortunately, it landed on a hot plate that he had to cook food during this test, and it just sparked. And the pure oxygen environment fed anything that was in it, caught on fire, and they could not get him out in time.
Inside the Soviet missile program, competition between rival divisions is fierce. One key player is Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, a man of great bravery and even greater arrogance. He is so determined to develop a rocket that can replace Korolev's R-7 as Russia's ICBM that he fuels his new rocket with a volatile mixture so dangerous it's known as devil's venom.
Marshal Nedelin wanted to be present at a very close distance. He instructed his team to bring a chair and to place it just next to the rocket. So everyone understood that it was violation of the rules, but he was a big boss. So he was sitting there, and every rocket scientist, every engineer thought, should I stay behind the walls, or should I go to sit next to the marshal? Otherwise, I would be considered as a coward. And dozens of people moved close to Marshal Nedelin. And then, unfortunately, there was a big accident. There was a huge explosion, and everyone, including Marshal Nedelin, was killed.
The fire burns for hours, fed by millions of pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen. Those not burned outright by the flames are splashed with the corrosive acids of the rocket fuel. Few escape. In all, more than 150 people die in the gruesome accident. The Soviet ICBM program is set back by the disaster. But Korolev continues to forge ahead with his plans to send a cosmonaut into orbit. His answer to NASA's Mercury is the Vostok, a huge craft that weighs nearly 5 tons. NASA is just as determined. They plan to jump ahead of the Soviets by putting an American into space in May 1961. Astronaut Alan Shepard is chosen to pilot the first manned Mercury rocket. Nobody is sure if Shepard's rocket or Shepard can survive the flight. But the Soviets surprise NASA. At the last minute, they announce that they will launch a man into orbit on April 12, 1961, 1 full month before NASA's launch. The cosmonaut chosen is Yuri Gagarin, handpicked by Sergei Korolev.
He liked the idea that Gagarin was a simple son of a peasant family, big smile on his face. And I think the reaction was really very, very chemical, personal.
On April 12th, the 27-year-old Yuri Gagarin sets out to make history. A Vostok capsule powered by Korolev's R-7 rocket is the vehicle that will take the first man into orbit around the Earth. Gagarin makes one Earth orbit in Vostok 1. The flight goes flawlessly. But there is an important secret the Soviets are keeping.
We didn't hear it officially from the Soviets at the time because they were presenting the fiction that he had landed in his spacecraft, because the international aeronautical rules required that a pilot had to take off in his aircraft and land to set a new record. And they were treating this as a new world record of the first space flight. So they just flat out lied about it. The genius of the original design was, well, let's just punch him out of there and let him parachute down. It's like, it's too hard for him to land in the spacecraft. Let's get him out of the spacecraft at 20,000 feet. And that's what they did. They just fired him out of there.
Gagarin is hailed as a conquering hero around the world. The Soviet Union has upstaged America once again. Between 1961 and 1963, the Russian star shines brighter than ever as each Vostok flight confirms the Soviets' mastery of space. Valentina Tereshkova is out to achieve another first for the Soviets as the first woman in space. She is to pilot Vostok 6 into history. Tereshkova takes off on June 16, 1963. In another blow to American pride, she logs in more flight time, 48 orbits, than all the male Mercury astronauts combined. With Tereshkova's safe return, the Vostok series comes to a triumphant end and emphasizes the Soviets' lead in the space race. America's Mercury flights end in 1963. having failed to overtake the Soviets in the space race. The next U.S. space program, Gemini, is gearing up for its first launch in March 1965. It will put not one but two men in space and provide practice in docking maneuvers crucial to the success of a moon landing. The Russians feel pressured by Gemini. Khrushchev orders Korolev to beat the Americans into space with not two men but three, inside a capsule with a pressurized interior. Three can be crammed into the new Voskhod spacecraft, but not safely.
There were three cosmonauts sent up in a Voskhod capsule, which was basically just a modified Vostok. And now the Vostoks had only carried one person. To squeeze three people in, it meant you had to take away their pressure suits. And there was no escape system. So if the rocket blew up or something went wrong during the launch, the three men just fried.
October 12, 1964. It is the first Voskhod launch, and for the first time, the Soviets will not be using an ejection seat. The cosmonauts will return to Earth inside their capsule. Retro-rockets and parachutes slow their descent, and the three-man crew lands safely deep in Russia. The Americans have been beaten into space again. In the spring of 1965, the Soviets are readying a second Voskhod mission for another space-age first. Pavel Belyaev and Alexei Leonov are the crew. Their mission, the first walk in space. There is no third cosmonaut on this trip. The extra space is needed for their spacesuits. Leonov trains hard on Earth, but in space there are dangers no one anticipates. On March 18, 1965, Leonov begins his historic spacewalk.
Leonov was really a guinea pig. He was trying out something that had never been done before. His spacesuit was pressurized, obviously because space is a vacuum. So if you didn't wear a spacesuit, your blood would boil and you'd die very quickly. Unfortunately, while he was out in space, the air inside his suit pushed it out. It was rather like a balloon. So he was much bigger than he would normally have been. And when he tried to squeeze back into the airlock entrance, he couldn't fit. So he therefore kept gradually dropping the pressure, hoping that it would become small enough so that he could fit in. And eventually he had to drop it below the permitted safety limit, in fact, before he could just about squeeze in feet first. But it was a real struggle.
Leonov's problems aren't over. He and Belyaev land off course and spend a cold night alone in the Russian wilderness before being rescued. The world is told nothing of the flight's flaws. For Korolev, the mission is another success and the last of the Voskhod series. He can concentrate now on the spaceship that will take his cosmonauts to the moon, the Soyuz. The Soyuz has been in development since Sputnik, nearly 7 years. The huge spacecraft weighs almost 7.5 tons, 1.5 times the mass of its predecessor, the Voskhod. However, the first Soyuz manned flight is still 2 years off.
Gemini 12, Gemini 12.
The Americans, meanwhile, continue flying Gemini missions. Between 1965 and 1966, Gemini amasses almost 1,000 hours in space. The Russians' Voskhod only 26. America has caught up in the space race. The testing of Korolev's Soyuz spacecraft moves forward under pressure from the Soviet leadership. It is at this crucial point that Korolev, the master of the Soviet space program, is hospitalized for routine surgery.
He goes into the hospital for what was supposed to have been a simple operation, and he thought he was going to be in over the weekend and back to work on Monday morning. The surgeon discovers he's got a huge malignant tumor the size of a fist. He issues an emergency call to get help. They can't find help. It was over the weekend. They tried to fit an oxygen mask on him, and because he'd had his jaw broken in the Gulag, they couldn't fit it properly.
The operation fails, and Korolev is given a state funeral. Ironically, he is honored in death as he could not be in life for the world to know Korolev's name. The new chief designer is Vasily Mishin, Korolev's former second in charge. Although a talented engineer, he lacks Korolev's organizational skills, political connections, and sheer bullying power. The loss of Korolev will haunt the Soviet space program for years to come. NASA is under pressure too to get a in 7. On January 27, 1967, during a routine training mission in the Apollo 1 command module, a fire breaks out. It quickly flares out of control in the oxygen-rich atmosphere inside the capsule. Within 16 seconds, the 3 astronauts are dead. The disaster is horrifyingly predictable and preventable. The cause? Bad wires, faulty installation, and poor quality control in a spacecraft packed with flammable materials. The Apollo disaster might have been avoided had the Soviets told the truth about Valentin Bondarenko's death in 1961. That too involved a fire in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. It will be 2 years before NASA's next manned flight. The American disaster provides the Soviets with an irresistible opportunity to retake the lead in the space race. They rushed the Soyuz into readiness for a launch in the spring of 1967. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov is scheduled to pilot the new Soyuz spacecraft.
It was clear that the administration to be along with another Soyuz in which there would be a rendezvous, if not a docking maneuver, and this was all going to happen at the 40th anniversary of the glorious October Socialist Revolution.
Soyuz engineers ask Brezhnev for more time to perfect Soyuz 1, but Brezhnev refuses. They must launch on time.
It seems likely that the Soyuz 1 was a fundamentally flawed spacecraft, and that the cosmonauts, the designers, those people that really understood the program, believed that they were likely to have a very big problem with it.
On April 23, 1967, Soyuz 1, with cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, is launched. The mission gets off to an ominous start.
Soyuz 1 unfortunately lost a solar panel and therefore didn't have enough power to stay up long enough for Soyuz 2 to come and rendezvous with it. So they decided to take Komarov back down again.
Komarov was having just a difficult time orienting the spacecraft, getting it to do what he wanted. The real problem was that the parachute system just suffered a series of failures. The first chute did not deploy properly and then did not separate properly. The emergency chute fouled with that, and the spacecraft never slowed down. It just hit the Earth at however many, 250 miles an hour.
Komarov has no chance. The crash is so thunderous, recovery teams cannot even distinguish human remains from the wreckage. Details of the disaster are a closely guarded secret. Komarov will be remembered, however. He is the first person to die during a mission to space. By 1968, America's Apollo program is back on track after the Apollo 1 disaster. That same year, the Russians struggle to iron out the problems of Soyuz. And the Soviets do just that. On October 30th, 1968, Soyuz 2 and 3 return successfully from a joint mission in space. For the first time, a Soyuz spacecraft has returned to Earth with its cosmonaut alive. 2 months later, on December 21st, 1968, Apollo 8 takes Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders around the moon. The Soviets must respond if they are to stay in the race. The Russians answer the challenge on January 14th, 1969, when Soyuz 4 and 5 make the world's first link-up between manned spacecraft. The Soviet dream of reaching the moon is tantalizingly close. But to get there, they need the massive N-1 rocket. It is the only Soviet rocket powerful enough to reach the moon. First envisaged by Korolev in 1961, the N-1 is finally ready for its first test launch 8 years later. On February 21st, 1969, the N-1 finally takes off. It performs beautifully for approximately 70 seconds. With the N-1 disaster, the Soviets lose all hope of winning the moon race. But they still have hopes the N-1 will get there before the end of the decade. 5 months later, they launch another N-1. And the Soviet dream of reaching the moon goes up in flames.
Forward. 60 seconds.
On July 20th, 1969, the race to the moon ends in triumph for America. The mysterious surface that has fascinated humanity for so long finally is conquered.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
However, the Soviets do not give up their dreams of glory in space. Instead, they simply exchange moon landings for space stations. The construction of the Salyut space stations during the 1970s becomes the burning focus of the Soviet space program. The first of Russia's space stations is the Salyut 1. This Soviet animation shows that Salyut 1 has 4 cylinders of differing diameters and lengths. 3 of them are pressurized. The 4th, which houses the propulsion unit, is open to space. The Soviets plan to launch the Salyut space station unmanned. Later, a 3-man crew flying separately aboard a spacecraft will dock with the station. In April 1971, the world's first space station is successfully put into orbit. Having reached orbit successfully, the station is ready for its first occupants. Vladislav Volkov, Georgy Dobrovolsky, and Viktor Patsayev will be the Salyut 1's first visitors. In order for all 3 to fit into the Soyuz 11, they must leave behind their pressurized suits. The Soviets have been sending cosmonauts into space this way since Voskhod 1. It's a big risk, but they're out to make history. On June 6, 1971, the 3 cosmonauts are launched in Soyuz 11 from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Soyuz 11 docks successfully with the Salyut station.
This mission was the first time the Russians had a space station up there. The whole country, from Kiev to Vladivostok, had been thrilled to watch these guys on television for weeks. They came to know them. They knew each of them.
After an unprecedented 23 days in space, it is time for the 3 cosmonauts to come home.
They had contact up until basically the moment of retrofire. The valve that was supposed to open in the lower atmosphere to let fresh air in opened earlier and let the life-sustaining air out. The air whistled out of that spacecraft in the space of about 30 or 40 seconds.
And as a result, the capsule was depressurized. Patsayev actually got out of his seat and recognized what the problem was, but was unable to close it fast enough.
And when the rescue crews came to open up the capsule, they wondered why everything was so quiet. There were no radio communications going on. And they found these 3 men just strapped in their seats, just lying there.
The cosmonauts cannot be revived. Without pressure suits, their blood has literally boiled. The Soviets have lost the dangerous gamble to fly without pressure suits. The price is paid by the 3 cosmonauts and their families. The Soviets would startle the world by agreeing to a joint mission in space with the United States. For the U.S., it would be the last of the historic Apollo missions. The world's first docking between spacecraft from two different nations is completed on July 17, 1975.
Soft docking. Okay, turn on the camera. Hit the remote. Glad to see you. Here.
The hostility between the superpowers that has cost so many lives and so much money is dissolved in the goodwill of the moment. By the 1980s, the Soviet visits to their Salyut space stations had become almost routine. On September 26, 1983, Soyuz T-10 is rolled out to the launch pad as cosmonauts Vladimir Titov and Gennady Strakhalov anxiously await an evening liftoff.
During the last minute of the countdown, a fire broke out at the base of their Soyuz launch vehicle. Both Titov and Strakhalov have said that they were sitting there knowing that they could see flames rising. They knew something was wrong, but nothing was really happening. They had to wait for the launch control team to initiate the abort. So it was a nerve-wracking 20 seconds waiting. When are they going to get us out of here? And the automatic escape system, which had never been tested with people on board, got its test. Solid rocket motor on the front of the Soyuz fired, pulling the vehicle, I think, about 4 or 5 miles high.
Cosmonauts Titov and Strakhalov have come within moments of a fiery death. While both will fly again on later successful Soyuz missions, this aborted launch is never officially recognized. As the 1980s continue, so does NASA's new space shuttle as it replaces the old Saturn V workhorse. For the first time in 6 years, Americans are going into space.
3, 2, 1, 0. And we have liftoff of America's first space shuttle.
While the shuttle is perceived as a great success, the reality is that it's much more expensive than the Saturn V to operate. And many in NASA think it's a costly mistake. However, this doesn't keep the Soviets from craving shuttle technology.
The key member of Politburo, who was responsible for military-industrial complex, he said, there is one critical argument. Americans are doing it. You think they are stupid? They are very pragmatic, and if they are doing it, it means that they know something else. Let's follow their example.
Rumors began that the reason for the remarkable similarity between the U.S. space shuttle and Soviet Buran is not engineering, but espionage.
I've seen their Buran, which is the title they use for their shuttle, and it does look very much like our shuttle. I suspect that they probably had drawings and they were never classified. I don't think they would have been very hard to get. I would be hard-pressed to say they stole them. In fact, if they wrote in, we might have sent them to them. I think they have very capable engineers who could develop a system like that, but I don't think they did.
I believe it was designed independently, and even if its shape looks familiar, you know, the shape is dictated by aerodynamics.
The Soviet shuttle flew once. Now it's in a city park in Moscow. It's in Gorky Park. Basically, they ran out of money. I mean, at a time where in 1990 their budget started going steeply down, the Buran was just eating up a lot of money. And so, as a result, it's sitting in a park right now.
Soviet resources go instead to their third-generation space station. It's called Mir, meaning peace. On February 20th, 1986, Mir is successfully launched. Mir has 6 docking ports, which allow unmanned scientific modules to dock with the station. It's remarkably flexible. Modules can return to Earth when their missions are complete, to be replaced by new modules carrying different experiments. While the Russians were able to fund the initial construction of Mir, the cosmonauts have had to resort to some unusual capitalist antics to keep it afloat.
The Russian cosmonauts these days have a really difficult and ironic job. They're asked to do an increasing number of kind of really cheap things like milk commercials and things, and they hate it. They hate it. And you can understand that. They're cosmonauts. They shouldn't have to do milk commercials.
Discovery, a magnificent picture, Mir crossing the horizon.
Mir was meant to last only 5 years. It is now approaching its 13th birthday and is fighting the American perception that it's outdated equipment ready for the cosmic junkyard.
Certainly a lot of things broke. The Soviets, or the Russians now, have demonstrated that they can improvise when problems come up. Now, often they do it in ways that makes us very nervous. And the risk they take is quite often more than we would like to take.
When something goes wrong up there, ever since 1971, they have to fix it up there. And that's given them an expertise in kind of seat-of-the-pants repairs that the Americans have only read about in books. And it's the one thing that, as people in NASA are kind of sniping and making snide comments about how the Russian program is falling apart, it's the one thing that we really realize the Russians have over us, is that type of experience.
In the 1990s, the strengths of both the Russian and American space programs would finally come together. By May 2001, the two nations, along with 14 other countries, would complete the world's first international space station. The Soviet space program led the race to the moon from 1957 to 1967. But due to the program's setbacks, the technological advancements of the United States ultimately prevailed. But despite the bitter Cold War, the universal quest for knowledge endured. Today, global cooperation in space is a reality.
If you thought today's shootouts were excessive, then you don't know history. In the Wild West, the whole town would join in. A free-for-all shoot-'em-up. Grittier and more gruesome than the movies. Check out the real firefights in the Wild West on Shootout, tonight at 9 on the History Channel.